and I was kind of like, it's Monday. Anyway, I have a special guest with me here today. I know Ms. Xander, and I think we've met a couple of times at Dreamforce events, but it's mostly been through the Twitters because he lives in Germany. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you, Kevin. My name's Sander, actually Christian Sander Knapp, but I go by Sander, and I live and work in Munich for Apero. That is German ISV. We do a quotations management app, and I also co-lead the developer group here in Munich since several years now. And I also got the honor of being a Salesforce MVP, and I am a developer by trade, but an admin by heart. That means I started my career with admin and then go into code. And I'm not, I didn't study computer sciences. I studied philosophy and literature. And from there, found my way into code and Salesforce and fell in love with the platform. And today we'll be touching a topic that was one of my very first topics when I worked with Apex, namely sending and receiving emails.
Yeah.
And I found it totally easy to do it back then, and it blew me away. It was easily configured and done. And when I tried to do the same, I started with PHP and Apache. Wasn't that easy? Not 2 clicks, and it's still 2 clicks basically in Salesforce, I believe.
Yeah. PHP and Apache. That's definitely dev on hard mode. So one of the things you have to do when you write these inbound email services is you have to create this inbound email handler. And apparently it came up so often that they went and they stuck the example code right there on the screen. And so if we were going to get started with this, should we get started by creating this class first or by, what do you think by, or just clicking the new email service? Because I think we need to create the class first, but it's been a while since I created one of these.
Yeah,
All right.
let's do the class, please.
So here in Visual Studio Code, what are we going to call this? We
Let's go. Well, first, hmm, yeah, you need to enter a class name. Is it? Well, they say it's my handler, so maybe let's start with my handler for a second, and
I'm
we
going to
can think
say
later.
inbound, just to stick with Apex recipes because we're putting this in Apex recipes. I'm going to say
Okay.
inbound email handler recipes.
Okay.
Um, I think, yeah.
Well,
Um,
are we doing really several recipes, or are we doing one recipe?
uh,
Because there will
d-
probably be just one implementation.
yeah, don't tell anyone, but we use that naming convention of recipes even if there's only one. So
Okay.
I'm gonna add a quick folder. No, I don't want to do that. I want to do new folder, and I'm gonna do email. My computer, email recipes, and underneath there, now I'll do create Apex class. We'll do email, inbound email, email handler recipes, and I'm gonna put it in our custom directory of email recipes. Okay. Now, I'm just gonna paste in down here. Oh, I'm not gonna paste that. I'm gonna paste in
No.
uh, the example code for what we have, for what they give us. Because there's some things in here that they do that I'm not sure we want to do. Like they make this a global class.
I'm not sure why they do that. We don't have to. If you don't have a real good reason to make a class global, please don't. And and I tried, it works with public just as well. So we can replace, first of all global with public.
And I'm going to give us a quick description. Um, description is demonstrates inbound email handler. That'll get filled out better in a little bit here. We don't need it with sharing though. We can do inherited sharing.
Yeah,
And inbound email handler recipes public. We've got to implement that class. What was that? Implement messaging dot inbound email handler.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um,
Okay.
That's basically everything we need. So technically, we already, so if we create now with a few clicks in our Scratch or the email service, then we already are done because it will receive an email and it will return a result and we will get no notification and no email, but technically we're already done. So if everything we want to do is loop an email through Apex and do nothing with it, we can already go.
All right, we've done it. Let's go home.
Yeah,
All right,
awesome.
we've created our inbound email service. We've done exactly what we want to do with the email. No, but we have met the minimum requirements. So let's go ahead and I'm going to copy this class name. I think we'll say Apex recipes inbound mail recipe, and we'll paste that class name in there. Do we want to accept attachments?
I think we want to play around with attachments today because the idea is let's do something with the email, but also do something with things that might be attached.
And I think there's a trick, sort of, I don't know if I'd call it a best practice, but a trick that I've seen where you just sort of coerce everything into being a binary attachment rather than leaving it as
Yeah.
some text and some binary. So I'm going to choose binary attachments only, or would
Yeah.
you do all?
I would do all and then click the convert text attachment to binary attachments checkbox.
It won't let me.
And,
Oh, here we go. There we go.
and there's also the advanced email security settings.
Check that.
And well, it depends where the email comes from. So if we're
Yeah.
using, for example, our Gmail ID, then we can click the box because Gmail is state of the art with all email protocols and certificates there is. And if you go over the little info button, there's lots to read about which kind of standards Salesforce is looking for. For our testing purposes, we'll leave it off. But for production users, it might be a good idea, depending from where you expect an email, to set it to prevent spam. Because another thing we need to consider with email services is that they're tied to limits. It depends on your number of user licenses. We won't go into details, but at the end of the day, somebody could spam your email service, and you want to prevent that by increasing security settings, or maybe we can talk at the end of the session if we would be able to write a simple spam prevention.
Yeah, I was thinking we might be able to write a debouncer or something like that. I'm going to leave the rest of the failure response settings just as they are for right now. We can always come back and adjust these. Uh,
Yeah.
but I'm going to hit save and add a new email address.
Did you fill something in the accept email from field?
I had not put something in that. To
We
cancel.
need to. So once
Yep.
again, little info button helps us. And if we send it from your email, then just enter your email and we're happy. You can also use domains and wildcards. It's a little bit tricky to set up. So please read the details if you need to go into more detail. Please read the details if you need to go deeper.
Yeah, I'm just going to do salesforce.com. That'll do that. Now we'll hit save and new email address.
And don't
Email.
be confused, we'll do that once again just now.
Say that again.
We will have another field in a second where we'll enter the same information, or rather a more specific email address, because when we create now a new email address, then there's also an accept email from field.
Apex, it's going to give us an email address. Specify the local part of the email address. Salesforce assigned this the domain name. So that's fine. Apex recipe, what are you going to do?
You can enter whatever is at the end. It will take your string and add lots and lots of more string and make an email address
Now,
out of it.
here's an interesting thing. The context user, there's no little help guide for the little context user. And I've always just left it as user. I don't think I've ever filled this out. Do you have a use for it?
Yes, because I usually want to control which user privileges are executing this Apex code and what they do. So if I use a user with little privileges, then some things might not work or break. And or rather, it depends on your implementation. I mean, if you take a user, then it's your own user in your Scratch org, which means your admin is the context user, which means you are almighty in Apex.
Yeah, it's good to set a user there. I remember back before we could do that, having to check for the check for other things. But it says user. Just to clarify here, I'm in a Scratch org, and so my username is user because that's the default for a Scratch org. Normally this would be like K Poorman or whatever your username actually is. So don't be confused by user.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you're in a Scratch org, you will probably have just one name. Yeah.
I'm going to hit save on that. Row. Cannot contain. Okay, so I got an error because my email address name had a space in it. So bad. That's on me. All right, we got that. Look at that email address we've got here. We've
Let's
got
see.
it's a
They are
gloriously
inbound at lots of gibberish at sandboxsalesforce.com.
yeah, lots of
We
gibberish.
need to copy that email address somewhere into our class. We'll need it for our testing, for our live testing when we try stuff out. Um, that email is now live, and the email service is now live, which means each email we send counts against our email limits.
Yep. And those are fairly generous limits, I think, even in a Scratch org, but it's still not something you want to do. Like, don't reach for this tool first.
No.
Right. Like, if you've got to hammer a nail into the wall, don't use a chainsaw. And, if you can get away with it, don't use email ever. There's chatter and Slack and carrier pigeons rather than email.
I'd love to see you implementing carrier pigeons to Salesforce, and that way I find email much more practical and pragmatic.
Do you remember back in the I was in college, so like early 2000s, there was the working group for Wi-Fi put out 802.11, and then I forget what the number was, but it was TCP/IP over carrier pigeon as an April Fool's joke.
Yeah.
I remember that.
My school wasn't that nerdy.
I I was I was nerdy. All right, so we've got this set up, and now we can actually do something with the data that comes in, and it's going to come in as these two objects. And I'm assuming the way this works, and I know that it kind of works this way, but I've never actually looked into the technical details of orders of operations on things. Basically, every time it detects an email at that address that it's given us, it will run this method for us with the messaging email itself and the envelope. And for those of you who are thinking, envelope, that sounds awfully not electronic mail. Well, you're not wrong. Envelope is the sort of metadata about the email that's coming in, right? So the envelope is going to be sort of the metadata, the meta object that has all the information in it, including the email and attachments and all that jazz. But yeah, and then we can turn around and we're going to create or we're at the end of this, we're going to create this result object, which is a new inbound email result, and return it. Which is interesting because now like those two things are separate from one another. Like we can do whatever we want in this inbound email handler, so long as in the end we also return that inbound email handler result object. Okay.
Yes.
So for our sort of use case, what we want to be able to do is look at the email and determine who sent it, and then find a contact that matches, attach the email that they sent as an email object in Salesforce.
Hang on. Let's type it a little because you see, we want identify contact. Okay, I can say identify contact, right?
Yep.
Over there. And sorry for interrupting you, but I thought it might be easier than
No, that's
identify
great.
contact. What will we do with the mail?
We need to
Email.
create an email record, email
Okay.
object from email.
So the idea is if I go into the Lightning experience and look at my activities, it will appear just like any other email will appear to me.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
Understood.
And then sort of like part 2 of that, um, we need to associate that email with the contact sender, because those aren't necessarily the same steps. And then we want to handle attachments, right?
Yeah. Maybe
Now,
we can use the recipe. You got a files recipe, I think, in the Apex recipe. By the way, I
yeah,
love recipes. I'm so glad we finally came around to have also a collection of to have, I mean, us Apex developers to also have a collection of recipes, not only LWC developers having libraries and example codes to work with. I love the library. Thank you so much, Kevin.
I so ladies and gentlemen, this is why I had him on, just so he could be my ringer and play up. No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I've always appreciated your wisdom and example code from Dreamforce talks and things that I've seen you do, and so I've always been like, you were the first person, by the way, to submit a pull request. So if you've ever looked inside the bin directory, you'll find this Organet PS1 file, and I have no idea what exactly it does, but I'm told that it is the init script, but for Windows users.
It is.
I was going to file a bug report on it because I understand at the end of it, it doesn't order you a Mac.
It doesn't. No, no,
So
no.
that's clearly a bug.
I deliberately skipped that requirement.
Okay, so how do we pull the contact out of here and grab that? Let's do this now. I'm generally the person who says, okay, if I've got sort of a workload to pull these to do this, that I would create sort of helper methods. So I would do private private ID, private contact, get sender.
One thing we can think about is for a moment is, okay, any email, any person on the whole world can send us an email. So what happens if we don't find a contact?
Yeah. So
And
this
what
kind of
I
needs to be an
is just like you suggested here, is to always return a contact. I never return null. I hate returning null. I find null the worst invention in coding. Well, the worst invention, full stop. I know I might be lopsided here, but no nulls. I don't return nulls. I throw exceptions, or I return something, but not null. And my idea would be, well, we need to identify the contact by email and by the sender address exactly, which should be a simple query. But what if the query returns 0 rows? What will we do then? And my idea would be, okay, we could still return a new contact, just with the email address, and let the rest of the code decide what they want to do or not do with the contact, because each part of the code can check for contact ID. And if a contact ID exists, we know a contact exists in the database. If not, we might decide later on to create one. Whereas I wouldn't, well, not a good idea, I think, to create for every unknown email address a contact. And we can also try to extract some information from the email itself. That's about it. So
now, would you do this in a try catch and just on a list exception, create the contact?
well, we need a temporary list in order to check it for 0, because we want to avoid all kinds of exceptions that might be raised by Apex if we really find no. So a bad idea would be to write a single inline SOCL saying contact my contact equals because that might return 0 rows, and then your Apex code throws an exception. So let's start with list contact.
Now you're doing a list contact, and that would allow us to catch certain exceptions. I tend to do contact and then combine that with a limit 1, so that I'm only getting one.
I think we've got 2 boundaries. We've got the one boundary that says we have 0 contact with that email address in our database, and we might have the other half of it being we got that email address several times in our database. Now, I depends on your data management and how well your work is, or maybe you have technical reasons to have the same contact under the same email address several times. So we might also get more than one. So not only should we use limit one, but also say, let's take the contact that has been created most recently, just to make sure we get one record. And then we only have to deal with what about zero records, and
Well, and if
that's
we
open
do,
to debate, whatever you like.
we'll get a no list as no rows for assignment exception if we do it as a list. But if we did it as a single contact, we would get that exception on 0 results.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
if we get zero results with a list, we get an empty list back, and we can check for empty and then, for example, return a new contact.
Okay, so for our contact, we want the, I mean, we're going to get ID automatically, so I'm trying not to put select ID in there just because
Yeah,
I'm trying to do that.
which is fine.
We can
Fine
pull
by
the
me.
account ID. Trying to think, we definitely want email.
Yeah.
See if there's what other things we want. I think that's probably it, right?
Um, just a little preview. Why are we querying already account ID? Because we know later on we will have to define it for the email message, or rather for another object that will be using the email message relation, because the email message as such is just the email. And in order to have it appear in the Lightning Experience UI in the Activities tab, you also need to create another object called email message relation, which basically says this person sent an email to that person.
Yep.
And as activities, they rely on who and what IDs. And those are polymorphic fields on activities. They're not on email message. Not well, there's one, but at the end of the day, oh yes, great, the security of enforced, obviously, yes, that's good. I got myself blown away by security enforced. I love
It's great,
security
isn't it?
enforced. Yes, yes. I mean, as an ISV, I still have, I'm completely open of it, lots of code that does the manual CRUD checking with all sorts of stuff. And what I should do is get rid of all that code and only use these kinds of queries. Because in my case, it's a simple, it works or it doesn't. There's no safeguards, and it would make my debug logs easier to read,
Exactly.
much less clutter. And that's the thing. Otherwise, user won't really realize, maybe a little bit faster, but I don't see all those checks. Each field needs to be cross-checked in our package, over and over again.
Exactly. Now, I just want to
Okay.
pause here for a second because I want to
Yeah.
remind people what we're talking about today and answer a question we've gotten in the chat. So that what we're doing today is working with inbound email services, which is one of those perennial topics of Apex discussion that people have tons of questions about all the time. And so we're talking about that. We're building one out. We got a question today from Sagar, how to change the auto-generated email for an email service. The generated email is too long and I want to shorten it. How do I do it? You can't, as far as I'm aware. That's an
No,
auto. Go
there's
ahead.
two things I wanted to say about the email address.
Yeah.
First of all, what I usually do for a business use case is I use Google for Business, and there I can create email addresses that work as groups. And there I hide those email addresses. So I can create an email address, or you can create a forwarding rule, for example, as well. Some nice short email address like helpme@mycompany.com, which internally gets rerouted to that Salesforce email address. But you need that rerouting. You can't have a change to email address. And be careful, because we talked a little bit about the sandbox part. Yeah, if you take some email service to production, you will get a different email address.
Yes, that's very important.
So
So if when you're setting up
please be
your
aware of that.
aliases using your company's what you're looking for, Cigar, is a technology called email aliasing, and it's going to be set up on your domain. Whoever runs your domain will know how to set that up, whether it's an Exchange server or Google for Work, etc. Basically what happens is they'll need to be able to set it up so that help@yourdomain.com is automatically forwarded to that long email that Salesforce generates for you, and you don't have any way of shortening that. You can only alias it. Is the long and short of it there. So what we're doing here is because ternaries can confuse new developers. We're saying if we have a contact list of size 0, if it's greater than 0, excuse me, then we're going to return that first element in our contact list. And since we've said we only want 1, we're only going to have 1 to deal with, but we're going to return that. Otherwise, we're going to return a brand new contact object like that. And I love that. It's nice and succinct. Very well done. I just always like to talk through my ternaries when I'm on stream. So with this, we can get a contact object up here. We're gonna, and let's just do contact sender.
That's sender. Yeah, exactly.
Equals.
I get easily confused by email addresses alone. I try to make it well, to find a good word for it. And for that, that's the one who's sending me in Salesforce an email.
Yeah, and so the question now is, how do we actually get that sender address that we want to use?
Because two ways.
Okay.
We have the inbound email and the envelope you said.
Mm-hmm.
And for today, I would say let's forget about the envelope.
Okay.
And just work with the email. The envelope has just 2 properties, to and from address. And technically, you could get the sender email from the envelope as well, but we will mostly need information from the email and can get it from there just as easily. And you need to know what kind of properties there are on the email, messaging.inbound email. Please look it up in the documentation. There are quite a few of them. We won't use all of them today. And we will see that unfortunately, email objects are treated differently on the platform. So, for example, in the inbound email, the to addresses is a list of objects, some kind of special objects. On an email, on my email message is a simple string. So sometimes I will need to convert a little bit, and that's a hassle because it's email. Both are email. One is email message, the other is inbound email. Understood, but basically represent an email. So why can't I just swap properties? We can't. Sometimes we need to do some conversion, and technically we can enter there where you are just now envelope dot from address, which would use the envelope. Or we can just go and use email.from address.
Now, okay. So those are largely interchangeable. Is what I'm taking away from address on envelope versus.
The real deal is not the from address, but to address. To addresses is a list of things on the email envelope, but just a comma separated string on the email message object.
Gotcha.
We'll get there. And one other thing, we don't need to check for null here. So will an email I'm receiving ever have a null email address? Probably not. So will I get contact by sender get a null for the email address? No. So we don't need to check if email address is not blank or whatnot.
I love how you said probably not.
Yeah, but it's technology. It can fail.
It's like make something null proof and somebody invent a better null. Okay, so we've got our inbound email address pulled up, and then we need to pull the next thing we want to do is create an email record. So I would say so whenever my sort of naming convention is if I'm generating something, I'm going to say create as the preface of a method name. If I'm getting something, I'll say get. If I'm synthesizing something, it's generate.
Okay, I just use create and get.
That's fair.
The same way as you do.
We should probably create the method before trying to use it.
Yeah, well, we can type text, and from a certain
If
point that our text is a method. Again, we can use a private
I can type, we can use
user.
private.
Yeah.
Uh, do we want to return a list of an email object or just
What do we
say
do with it?
void? Because
I'm
ultimately
for
we want to
void because we will just done and we'll be
fire and
done with it.
forget. Yeah, okay, void.
Yeah. And some things I didn't try yet. I think it's technically possible. What we will do is get the attachments and add them to the contact record, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's also technically possible to add the attachments to the email with a little bit of magic. I haven't explored that yet, so please don't force me to write it today. It will probably not work.
Okay,
Okay,
so
what do we need for the email record? Okay, we already know the contact because that's what we painted, the sender.
mhm.
That's something we need. And well, the email. The format of the email is still messaging inbound email.
Just inbound email, and we'll call this one email. Okay, now I know that it's possible to create the email record, but it's not intuitive. I had to go look it up last time I wanted to do this because it's not actually an email record, is it? It's a type of task, isn't it?
Not anymore.
Not
Um,
anymore. Okay.
bef- Before enhanced email
Oh, that's
and
right.
case to email, Salesforce Classic used a simple task, and they pasted the body of the email into the task description, and that was it. Nowadays, you don't need to insert a task or an activity anymore. You need the email message, and as mentioned earlier, the email message relation. And as we will see, or our test classes will show, um, uh, if you insert one, you get two records because it's reciprocal.
Ah, okay. All right.
So basically, maybe what do we want to do? First of all, we want to hang on. Can I type? Yes, certainly. Um, yeah, here we are. Um, Create the email message as object.
Mm.
And then we will do an insert email message relation as also as object.
And that's what's
And
going to associate
yes,
another
that's
S
what
object record too.
and in the UI, we will see, okay, received an email. And
Yeah.
only during testing, I found out about the last thing is that the email message relation will create two records. We will insert only one. But if you create a database with just one contact and just your test code, you will see it returns two. So my tests failed because I intuited that I inserted one record, so I can insert for one record in the database. And the test said, fail, because there's actually two.
Gotcha.
And I love writing test code because that's how you can find out those niceties. Because if I just dump it into the database, I never do the queries and look it up how many relations are there if I do it by execute anonymous, or in live. But as soon as I write tests about it, things like these appear easily, and I learn a lot about most of the Apex thing about. No, sorry, I learned most of the things in Apex by writing Apex tests.
Exactly. Exactly. And I like to when I was running dev teams, when I would bring somebody new onto the team, I would only let them write tests for the first week because it gave them an insight as to where everything was, and it also
Yeah,
got us test coverage for things that didn't have test coverage. But I was also told that was mean. So, we did some prototyping of this beforehand, and you've got a gigantic honkin' constructor for this, and I tend to do it this way. So I'm curious as to what your property like that is. Do you have out of curiosity, do you have a reason for doing it in the constructor rather than multiple lines?
I'm lazy as hell. So
Okay,
why
that
should
carries
I
the day.
retype message dot something?
That
It's
carries the
just
day.
retyping.
Okay. So if you've never done one of these, it's pretty easy. You're going to do text body and set that to be email dot. Is it? Because it's not text body. It's is it plain text? Yeah,
Plain
plain
text
text
body.
body.
Yeah.
And then semicolon, and then
Let's continue
HTML
with body,
body,
HTML body.
um, body.
So maybe for people who have not yet looked at an email in technical terms. So why are there two message bodies, or what is the message body? Basically, it's a payload. So if you type a subject in your email, and then you have the big text area where you enter your message, and that's what we call body here. And depending on your email clients used, you have a fancy email with images, then it's probably a HTML body because it's used HTML as websites do. It might just be a plain text body with no formatting and whatsoever, and both will be recognized by Salesforce and most email programs and stored and handled. Because email clients are sometimes, or no, yeah, email sending clients know that some receivers can only see plain text, some receivers can see HTML. So they send two versions of the mail, and you can, or are they all auto converted? No, I think two versions are sent, plain text and HTML, right?
Yeah, it's yeah. I refer to the HTML body as the Outlook body because I remember when Outlook was sort of like the thing you had to use if you wanted images and make it look pretty. And now I read in I read my email in plain text because I'm tired of all the buy this stuff that I get. Um, so headers are sort of again the metadata of the email, and we're going to store that as well. So when it came in and who it was from and where how it got to us, the DKIM, which is sort of a cryptographic signature saying I promise I'm not a dirty spammer, that kind of thing. We got our headers. We can do the subject.
Mm-hmm.
That one's just subject, right? There's not a
No.
different change to it. And then we've got from name, and that one's fun because this is where you can get like your from name in the email client can be different than the name of the contact, which is why we did our matching to contact based off email address, not off the name, because I imagine like I've got one of my email addresses set up. If you hit me up on my blog, when I reply to it, it comes from CodeFryer because random people on the internet don't need to know my real name. But otherwise, it shows up as my real name. Um, we'll do from name. What else do we need to put in here? We got from.
We need the to address
We need the to
and
address.
the from address, yes.
Okay. Is
And
it?
that is
This
the
is
two
the.
addresses, and then you probably need to join them.
Yeah.
So string join, that's one of the string join. Yeah. Yeah.
I come from a
Um,
my native my
email.
native programming language is one where join is an instance method rather than a class method. So I always keep trying to just put
Same
in.
here.
Yeah.
As soon as I work for for a for a longer time in JavaScript, I always forget there's just string.join and not an instant method join. Okay, we have the to address, and now we have, well, how does Salesforce work? How the to addresses identify the contact with Salesforce actually works with record IDs. So we also have a to IDs field. And let's take a little shortcut here because we talked about the context user,
Mm-hmm.
which means that will be the running user for my email. And somebody was the recipient of the email. And that might be a user in my org. And I need to identify the user because the two IDs should be contact IDs, lead IDs, or user IDs. The classic candidates for the who ID field. So if I do what you did there, then it will be always the running user, the context user I selected that will be treated as a sender, as a receiver, which means in the UI, all emails seem to be going to me. And in a real world project, I would try to identify the
Oh, I
two
see.
IDs by looking at the email address and find out, is it okay? Is it a user? And for our use case, it's a user. Okay. So I would do a query on the user database and find out which user is tied to the receiving email. And then I would not put my user ID or the context user ID, but the receiving user ID into two IDs.
So we should, for right now, I'm going to leave it because I'm afraid we're running out of time. But we should query the user table to find the ID of the recipient.
Mm-hmm.
Recipient. Words are hard. Okay. Um, so we've got the two IDs in there, and then let's see. Do we? But there's a flag called incoming, um, and we're gonna set that to true. I always
Yep.
figured that if you were creating it, it knew it was incoming, but you have to set that. And then we've got a status field. There's a status field. Do you want to explain what the status field is? Because this is unintuitive.
It is, and we need to put a string 0 in there,
Yeah.
which translates to draft. And honestly, there is no status for received. Because those status are basically the statuses for emails going out of Salesforce. So a salesperson sitting in front of the records, sending a new email, and then you have a draft status and a bound status or a send status, but there's no official received status for those emails.
Yeah. Um, Now the other thing so I always thought that was weird because there's not a way to say that it's received, but this also means that in the UI it shows up as unread initially, and I haven't found a way around that.
Nope.
Um, but okay, so we got that. We also have this one called message date, and we could do all sorts of interesting things with message date. In our sort of prototype code, you put down system.now, but I want to ask if there's a way to pull that from the email, because it could be that we hit our limit and our email was queued and then processed
Mm-hmm.
later. So I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to do this so that we have a good idea of when it actually got here. And is there a receive date or?
Not to my knowledge. What I would do is look into the headers and look for the date information there. We should find something, but I don't think there's a date on the inbound email. Let me see.
Inbound email class, because we might want inbound envelope, but
No, envelope has just those two.
Headers. The list of RFC 2822 headers includes date. So we could do, and that's going to be an inbound header, and in our code base, headers appear. We did toString, and that may not be strong enough coercion. Does it need to be string value of? This is safer.
I use string value of.
Okay.
So would you know the exact title of the RFC property? Because we would need to go deep into the inbound email header class and look for it there.
Yeah, so it looks like the list of RFC 2822 headers will be, there's one called date. So theoretically we could do get date.
No, we can't because it's not a map, it's a list.
What?
Yeah.
It's got a get set. Oh, you're right, it is a list. And it's going to be, this is going to be the header with the name value.
Yeah. And then you need to loop through it and then find the specific name and then parse the value into.
So we're going to use date.now for right now. Welcome to the rabbit hole. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
it's technically doable. You're right. Yes.
We've got related to ID. Sorry, go ahead.
And that's where the contact comes in,
Yep, contact dot.
the account ID, and we call it sender. Sorry, so the sender account ID.
Yep, ID. So we've got a big honking constructor because we're lazy and we don't want to have to type message all over again. And oh, that's because sender.
Here.
Yep, it is sender.
And also, we talked about it. What do we do if this happens? My take would be we do nothing. We say thank you, bye. So because if I don't have a contact,
you're not going to have the account.
And I'm not having the account. I'm not sure. I didn't try to insert an email message without a related to ID. I don't think it makes sense to insert an email message without a related to ID. So yeah.
Uninserted contact. Okay. Just to give a little context.
Or we could create one, obviously. I mean, instead we could make the decision, okay, we extract name from email and deal with duplicate detection and everything, which might blow our time completely.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so we've got our method for saving that, but we haven't saved it yet. So try insert. What do we call it? Message. You know, you're doing system now instead of date now. Why?
Because the compiler said does date now work?
Should.
It says method does not exist.
Oh, it's daytime.
Signature. Ah, okay. Thank you. Learned something.
I don't know what system now does, but my guess is that one of them is an alias to the other.
Yeah.
So we're going to insert message here. We got a couple of, you want to catch this while I answer a couple questions here. Segar, does toString not work? toString might work, but there is a stronger way of coercing something to a string in Apex, and that's to do string.valueof. If you do string.valueof, you will always end up with a string. It might be a blank string, but you'll always get a string. If you do something.toString, if that object isn't aware of how to coerce itself to a string, it will just blow up. So it's a little bit safer or a little bit stronger form of coercion to use the string.valueof. But that's a good question. And then Yang, anybody know where to find this sample code after this is live? I'm going to ask moderator Sarah to paste in the URL, but it is github.com/trailheadapps/apex-recipes. And it's going to have a lag time of about a week because there's some cleanup and code reviews and that sort of stuff that goes on from the time we hang up the live stream today to the time that today's code will live in the Apex recipes. So we've got a catch there. Maybe
I deliberately didn't do anything with the catch, although you told me otherwise, because I wanted to ask you, so what is my intention with the catch block here? So okay, do we want to raise another custom exception? If so, why here and not a little bit up in our main entry method? Because that's probably the place where we want to handle all exceptions that might happen. I mean, if I call this method and I get an exception, what would you want me to do with it?
That's a good question. I think so. Let's think about what might cause this to be an exception. Some things that might cause this to be an exception are no access to email message object, and I'm not sure you can. That's a standard.
There's to my knowledge no FLS on those fields, so no access, and it's a standard object. It's an internal standard object. I don't think an admin
can
say. I will look it up quickly, but you can't turn it off.
So this coercion could fail, but that's not going to cause an insert to fail, because I'm guessing headers isn't required. This could fail if that's not a valid cross-reference ID.
But two IDs is polymorphic, so as long as it gets a UI, user IDs or contact IDs or lead IDs, it seems to be happy. If it
Yeah,
does the check even,
that's true. That's
because it's
true.
just a new list string.
So I'm guessing that if we throw an exception, if we catch an exception here, we need to pass that back up. But since this is a method that is void and it's sort of fire and forget, I'm not entirely sure. Like, my inclination would be to throw another exception and let it die, at least in the context of Apex recipes. I wouldn't do that in a production code, but you know, I also know that this is supposed to be example code, not necessarily something that you want to copy and paste directly into your org. So
Can I make a suggestion
yes, please.
quickly? So let's do away with that, for example, for a bit, and do your try catch block here. Oh yeah, thank you for scrolling.
Yeah.
That's what we want to do within the try catch block. We could catch for different types of exceptions, but we will do
I think we copied the
simple
wrong
one.
thing in there. Because we've written sender in a way that shouldn't throw an exception, but it's this one, the result here, that we want to put in there, or the
Actually, we got some DML methods upcoming here,
Oh, that's
like
yeah,
our insert email message.
that's true.
And that's the next code line of code I would add here, maybe in comments, create email record. So we made sure our query can't fail. Okay, we're not expecting exception there. So technically, we put it above the try catch statement. This one could fail, and maybe the next one could fail as well when we're creating attachments. And what do we do with the exception? And one thing you can do very easily is say result success is false, and set the message to well, that was my inclination. So I wanted to do exception get
Message,
message,
yeah.
for example. But that never worked.
Really?
No. What worked was the following. So I never got an email result. The idea is if result message is filled, I will get a response email. What helped is to say string. Oops, sorry. Message is a blank string,
Mm-hmm.
and I copy it over here. I usually go for the stack trace string as well.
So yeah.
Then I just check for result success. And if it's not successful, I return a message, and only then. And which message will I return? My error message. And then in my tests, everything worked in terms of I get an email, because for testing, you might want exactly that. You don't want to have the developer console open and wait for the asynchronous inbound email result. You want an instant reply if an exception happens, and that made it possible for me.
Nice. Nice. I like that. So we still need to, I'm going to clear this out here because I want to make it fit a little bit more on the screen. But we need to insert our, well, we don't have an insert here. Our create email record down here is not inserting anything. So we probably want to do that, right?
Yeah.
So we're just going to capture that. We're going to catch it higher up.
So what penalty are we expecting, Kevin, for being over time?
We do have to stop exactly in 5 minutes here because there is a session right after us. But like we can always find a time to bring you back, or I can work on it some on my own here because I don't think we're gonna get to testing today. Or
Okay, since we have only 4 minutes and we were still a little bit far off the finishing line. Are there still open questions? Are there some things that our listeners want to hear or have tried, or anything we can help with in the last minutes? Because I feel that would be maybe a good service
Yeah,
for our listeners.
yeah. This is the opportunity for questions, comments, Snyder marks from or fixing the bug that prevents us from pushing it. So our query up here with security enforced. All right, fix that. Typing's hard. Let's go shopping. Nanda says this is great. I vote for another session. We can work on finding Email Never Dies Part 2. Revenge of the Email.
Well, we could do, I'm open for it, because I feel sorry because we promised so much, like doing this and doing that and doing that, and then we talked so much and wrote so little that we didn't get to the juicy parts with attachment, and I think that would be probably an interesting case.
Attachments and testing.
Yeah.
Sounds like a Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance style. Zen in the Art of
But
Attachment
we got
saving.
you started. We got you started. If you use that here, and maybe in the last 2 minutes, we will get the message relation still. Can we finish the message relation, Kevin?
The message relation.
Yeah.
So
create email record, because if we do that, then we would have at least a little bit of code untested, which is poor, Sander, because I believe one should write tests and code alongside, but it's difficult to do in codeLive. Okay, we have the message, insert message, and then we need the email message relation, and let me just, that's a pretty easy object because it has just a few properties.
Yep.
But what we need is the ID of the email message. Again, remember, this little object helps Salesforce relate the actual email message to you as a user or to something like a contact.
Yep.
We need the message ID, the relation ID, which would be our contact ID, so the sender ID again.
Relation ID is equal to our sender ID.
Yeah. And then there's one of the things that you need to know. There's a relation type, and it needs to be from address in that case.
And that's just a string.
Yeah.
From address. ADDRESS. Yes, okay. And then our last one is the relationship. Relation address? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's going to be
the sender email. Yeah.
Cool. And then we should insert that too.
Yes. And as I mentioned, I found out during writing Apex tests that when I insert this one object, then I get 2 objects in the end, 2 records. Sorry, not objects, 2 records.
Cool. Sandra, thank you very much for joining me. We'll get you back on.
Thank you.
We'll do attachments and testing here. We are in the final seconds because we've got somebody coming up right afterwards. But I do have a question from Raj. Will it automatically create the message relation records if we specify a list of contact IDs in the to address of the email message record? And I don't have a good answer for you for that one that I can do here in 10 seconds. So we will have to come back to that. Thank you very much, and we will see you all again. I hope to see you all next Thursday.